Hello, I'm Paula White, and I'm here with this exclusive YouTube video, and we're talking about how does God speak to us? Biblically speaking, how do we know if something is God's voice? How do we recognize it? How do we discern it? The importance of that is there are three voices. There's God's voice, there's the enemy's voice, and there's man's voice. Now, if I'm making life decisions, who do I marry? Do I live here? Is this my ministry? What's my purpose in life? How do I know it's the voice of God? The last thing that we want to do is derail our life, listening to the wrong voice. And hearing the voice of God is not the easiest thing. But the Bible clearly gives us 8 specific ways that God speaks. And John chapter 10, verse 27 says, "My sheep know my voice." It means they're intimate with it, and they will follow it. So once you know the voice of God, and it's training. It's kind of like when you get familiar with someone, and you can hear a syllable just of their voice or something, and you know immediately. Like if your father were to call you and say, "Hey," or whistle, or whistle a certain way in the neighborhood, you would know that's my dad's whistle, or that's my dad's voice. Well, the same way you begin to get accustomed or used to God's voice. We've covered 3 ways that God speaks. Number 1, through prophets or prophecy. Number 2, through tongues and interpretation. Number 3 is through a still, small, quiet voice. And that's often calmness, what we call meditation, silence. And the 4th way we're going to look at how does God speak is through an audible voice. I've served the Lord for almost 30 years now. And there are many times, one of the ways is that God impresses things in our spirit. And I'll give you scripture for that. But in 30 years, I've never heard the audible voice. I would love to hear the audible voice. I think I'd probably fall down and be like, oh my gosh, I don't know, maybe I'd die if I heard the audible voice. Who knows? I mean, it's just, I couldn't imagine. It'd be like thunder. Watch God speak right now, the audible voice, while we're doing this. But He does throughout Scripture, and not just to Jesus, but to others. I'm speaking an audible voice. Let's go into the New Testament first. In Matthew chapter 3, verse 17, it says, "And lo, a voice from heaven said, 'This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased.'" You know the story. Jesus is being baptized. He's being baptized by John the Baptist. The heavens open, a dove descends, but the voice of God comes, says, "This is my beloved Son, whom I'm well pleased." It's an audible voice. So it wasn't just Jesus hearing it. Everyone heard the voice of God. In Matthew chapter 17, verse 5, it says, "While he yet spake, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them. And behold, a voice out of the cloud which said, 'This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased. Hear ye him.'" John chapter 12, verse 28. "Father, glorify thy name. Then came there a voice from heaven saying, I have both glorified it and will glorify it again." So we see I gave you 2 scriptures for the first one, but 2 different examples right there where God audibly speaks. In Acts chapter 9, verse 7, "And the men which journeyed with him stood speechless, hearing a voice, but seeing no man." So again, God audibly spoke. Don't you wonder what the voice of God would sound like? I mean, my kids are wonderful. Brad, my son, thinks it sounds like Batman. And I forget what Hank thinks it sounds like. What do you think it sounds like, Hank?
Green Arrow.
Like Green Arrow. I don't know. I just picture this really majestic voice speaking. Green Arrow. I don't know. But anyway, God does speak audibly. I just wonder, like, whose voice would that be? Moses, what is it with Charlton Heston or whatever, the 10 Commandments. I mean, how do you play God's voice? So in Deuteronomy chapter 5, it says, "Moses called all Israel and said to them, 'Hear, O Israel, the statutes and judgments which I speak in your ears this day, that you may learn them and keep and do them.'" So God again speaks in a very audible voice. "I am the Lord thy God, which brought thee out of Egypt." And I'm not going to read you in the entire chapter, but he goes through the whole thing. Then let's look over here in 1 Samuel chapter 3, and we'll land with this one. It says, "And the child Samuel's dedicated to the Lord because, Hannah was barren. She wanted a son. she makes this deal with God and says, look, if you give me a son, I'll give you a prophet. Because she knew that Israel needed a prophet, needed an eye and a voice to see and an ear to hear. And she dedicates, and she goes to the altar, lays out before the altar, really gets the bitterness of her soul out, and she gets pregnant. She doesn't just have Samuel. She ends up having 5 children. But she takes Samuel, dedicates him to the Lord, as she said, as a prophet. And God will use him in the office of a prophet all the days of his life. He'll never miss the word of the Lord. He has 3 regions that he can prophesy in. But when he's being trained, this is important, when he's first coming into his gifting, his office, he's put in the quarters or the house of a priest by the name of Eli, who was not a wicked priest, but he wasn't a righteous priest. And what we mean by that is he compromised. He had wicked sons, and because he himself lived righteous before the Lord, but he tolerated the wickedness of his sons. He didn't stop that. And there was a lot of impact on Israel and on the people. So this child Samuel ministered to the Lord before Eli. So he submitted to his pastor, submitted to the priest. And the word of the Lord was precious in those days. There was no open vision, so that the heavens had been shut, etc. It came to pass at that time, when Eli was laid down in his place, that his eyes began to wax dim, that he could not see. And the lamp of God went out in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was, and Samuel was laid down to sleep, because the light could never go out where the ark was. And verse 4, that the Lord called Samuel, and he answered and said, here I am. And he ran to Eli, because see, Samuel thinks it's Eli. He ran to Eli and said, here am I, for thou hast called me. And he said, I didn't call you, lie down again. And he went and he laid down. Verse 6, and the Lord called yet again Samuel. And Samuel rose and went to Eli and said, here I am, for you called me. And he answered, said, I didn't call you, my son, go lie down. Verse 7, now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, neither was the word of the Lord yet revealed unto him. And that's a key thing right there. And the Lord called Samuel again the 3rd time. And he arose and went to Eli and said, here I am, for you called me. And Eli perceived that the Lord had called the child. Therefore Eli said to Samuel, go lie down, and it shall be, if he call thee, and thou shalt speak. Speak, Lord, for thy servant heareth. So Samuel went and lay down in the place, and the Lord came and stood and called as other times. And Samuel answered, speak, thy servant heareth. And the Lord said unto Samuel, behold, I'll do a thing in Israel. And he goes on to give him the word of the Lord. So the key here is that God does speak in an audible voice. I don't think it's really often that you hear the audible voice, but it's both Old Testament and New Testament. And Samuel got conditioned to hear God and to discern his voice in that way. And speak, thy servants hear. So people who say, God spoke to me, God spoke to me, God spoke, God said, God said, God said. I'm like, how did God say? Because God speaks in very specific ways. And an audible voice of God, I think, would make all of us tremble, or all of us stand attention. Samuel had that kind of relationship with the Lord. Remember, he's just a child. He's growing into his office. He's growing into his gift. So he's understanding how God speaks. And he said, thy servant, I'm here to serve. What are you trying to tell me, God? What are you saying to me? And then God begins the purpose and the plan. So we see through Scripture that one of the ways that God speaks is through an audible voice. We'll keep teaching you so you can know, is this my flesh? Is this the enemy? Or is this God?